They whispered it first. In officers' messes where whiskey glasses clinked against maps of conquered territories. In guarded letters home where words had to be chosen carefully. Where censors watched for defeatism. Where even admitting doubt could mean a bullet. In the quiet moments between battles, when the adrenaline faded and reality seeped back in like poison gas. Long before the Allied bombs fell upon Dresden, turning the city into a furnace that consumed 70,000 lives in a single night. Years before Hitler's pistol echoed in the bunker beneath Berlin, that final gunshot that marked the end of everything. Some of Germany's most capable generals, men who had conquered nations and commanded armies, already knew a truth they could never speak aloud. The war could not be won. It did not happen in one moment of revelation, no single battle where defeat became obvious, no particular day when the scales fell from their eyes. The realization crept in slowly, incrementally, like darkness falling at the end of a summer day. First as unease, that uncomfortable feeling in the pit of your stomach that something isn't quite right. Then as doubt, those moments when you look at the map and the numbers don't add up, when you realize the enemy has more divisions than you thought, more tanks than intelligence reported, more will to fight than propaganda claimed, and finally, as grim certainty, as the knowledge that you are watching a slow-motion catastrophe unfold, and there is nothing you can do to stop it. The men who had once basked in the aura of invincibility, who had conquered Poland in 27 days, who had brought France to its knees in 6 weeks, who had made the entire world tremble at the sound of German panzers, began to glimpse the abyss behind their triumphs. They saw through the propaganda to the reality beneath. They understood the mathematics that Hitler refused to acknowledge. They knew, and yet they would still obey. They would still command. They would still send men to die. They would do so knowing that the end was written long before the curtain fell, knowing that every order they gave, every attack they launched, every defense they organized was simply delaying the inevitable. This is the story of when they knew, of how they knew, of why they kept fighting anyway. In the early summer of 1941, the Wehrmacht stood at its zenith, at the absolute peak of its power, at that perfect moment when everything seemed possible. In less than 2 years, the armies of Hitler's Germany had accomplished what seemed impossible. They had conquered Poland, smashing through the Polish defenses in a campaign that lasted barely a month. They had taken Norway in a daring operation that combined air, sea, and ground forces in ways no one had attempted before. They had swept through France, the Low Countries, Denmark, Yugoslavia, Greece, conquering nation after nation with a speed that stunned the world. The generals who had spent the interwar years nursing resentment and working under constraints imposed by the Treaty of Versailles now felt vindicated. Proven right, their theories confirmed by victory after victory. Their doctrines had worked. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, the combination of tanks and aircraft and infantry moving faster than the enemy could react, had revolutionized warfare. The world trembled before their precision and speed. They were the best army in the world, and they knew it. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, the largest military operation in human history, 3 million German soldiers crossing the Soviet border in a front that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. They believed they were witnessing the culmination of German military genius. This would be the crowning achievement, the final victory that would establish German dominance over Europe forever. Hitler had promised them that the Soviet Union was a rotten structure that would collapse with a single kick. Intelligence reports, carefully selected and interpreted to confirm Hitler's beliefs, suggested the Red Army was weak, demoralized, poorly led, incapable of sustained resistance. Columns of panzers roared across the endless plains of the Soviet Union like iron locusts, crushing everything in their path. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock's Army Group Center advanced hundreds of kilometers within weeks, moving so fast that Soviet units were encircled before they could retreat. Prisoners flooded in by the hundreds of thousands, Entire Soviet armies surrounded and captured, soldiers marching into captivity in columns that stretched for miles. By autumn, by September and October, when the leaves were turning and the first cold winds were blowing across the steppes, many officers genuinely thought the war would soon end in triumph. Moscow would fall. The Soviet Union would collapse. Hitler's prophecy of destroying Bolshevism in a single campaign seemed not just plausible but inevitable. But beneath the confidence, beneath the victory reports and the congratulatory telegrams and the Iron Crosses being distributed to successful commanders, ran a quieter unease. Some officers, veterans of the First World War who remembered the meat grinder of Verdun and the Somme, who had seen what happened when Germany tried to fight a war of attrition, recognized a dangerous familiarity in what was happening. The front was too wide, stretching across hundreds of miles, requiring armies to defend sectors that were simply too large to hold properly. The logistics were too fragile, supply columns struggling to keep up with advancing armies, fuel and ammunition arriving late, food running short. The supply lines were too long, stretching back hundreds of kilometers across primitive roads, across rivers with bombed bridges, through partisan-infested territories. Heinz Guderian's panzer spearheads raced far ahead of their supply convoys, sometimes advancing so quickly that they literally ran out of fuel and had to sit still for days waiting for supplies to catch up. Motorized divisions were immobilized for lack of fuel, the irony of having the finest tanks in the world, but no gasoline to power them. Infantry divisions followed days behind the tanks, unable to keep up with the mechanized advance, leaving huge gaps in the line that Soviet units could exploit. Yet Berlin, yet Hitler and his staff who looked at maps but never visited the front, who saw arrows advancing on paper but never felt the mud, or smelled the diesel fumes or counted the dead, demanded further advances, ever deeper into Russia's vast interior, toward objectives that kept shifting and changing. By November 1941, as the first snow fell on exhausted troops who were still wearing summer uniforms because nobody had planned for a winter campaign, as temperatures dropped and engines froze and weapons jammed, that unease hardened into dread. The Soviet Union had not collapsed. It should have, according to every German calculation, according to every intelligence estimate, according to Hitler's prophecies. But it hadn't. New divisions appeared from the east, armies that weren't supposed to exist, units transferred from Siberia, from the Far East, fresh troops who weren't demoralized or defeated. The Red Army, bloodied but unbroken, counterattacked outside Moscow in December, the first major Soviet offensive, catching German units completely by surprise. Temperatures plunged below -30 degrees Celsius, -40 in some places, cold beyond anything most German soldiers had ever experienced. Equipment failed, tanks wouldn't start, weapons froze, men got frostbite, and the invincible Wehrmacht stalled for the first time, actually stopped advancing, actually gave ground, actually retreated in some sectors. That winter, in field headquarters, where officers huddled around inadequate stoves, in forward dugouts, where commanders made decisions while their breath froze in the air, the first fatal doubts began to take root. Officers who had believed in a short, decisive war, who had been promised that the Soviet Union would collapse in weeks, who had planned to be home by Christmas, now faced the same grinding attrition they had once sworn to avoid. Logistics were crippled, supply systems that had been designed for a short campaign breaking down under the strain of a winter war. Reserves were depleted, replacement divisions arriving at the front, understrength and poorly trained. Morale was brittle, soldiers writing letters home asking when the war would end, wondering why they were still fighting. Some officers, a few at first, but growing in number, whispered that the war was already unwinnable. They did the math. They looked at the casualty figures. They compared German losses to Soviet losses and realized that even when Germany won battles, even when they killed 10 Soviets for every German, the Soviets could afford it and Germany couldn't. Others pushed such thoughts away, refused to think about it, convinced themselves that spring would bring victory, that Hitler knew something they didn't, that new offensives would break Soviet resistance. But no one who survived the winter campaign of 1941, who watched men freeze to death in their foxholes, who saw entire divisions reduced to skeleton strength, could mistake the truth. Germany was not fighting a campaign anymore. It was mired in a war of exhaustion against a foe it had underestimated in every conceivable way. In 1942, Hitler demanded renewed offensives to restore momentum, to recapture the initiative, to prove that the setbacks of winter were temporary. The generals obeyed, because that's what generals do, because their entire professional identity was built on obedience to orders. But their confidence was hollow now, brittle, no longer backed by the certainty of victory. The Wehrmacht launched Case Blue, Fall Blau in German, its drive toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. The plan was bold, aggressive, ambitious, but also reckless in ways that professional military men could see immediately. It divided the army's strength across immense distances, splitting forces between two objectives that were hundreds of miles apart, violating the basic military principle of concentration of force. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock protested directly to Hitler, warning that splitting forces between Stalingrad and the Caucasus risked catastrophe, that you couldn't pursue two objectives simultaneously without weakening yourself fatally. Hitler dismissed him with contempt. "You always see black clouds," he snapped. "You're too pessimistic. You lack the will to victory." Bock was relieved of command, sent into retirement, replaced by commanders who would obey without questioning. As the panzers rolled southward in the summer of 1942, raising columns of dust that could be seen for miles, many officers knew the campaign's logic was fatally flawed. They could read maps. They understood logistics. They saw that the further south they went, the longer their supply lines became, the more vulnerable they were to counterattack. The distances were vast, hundreds of kilometers of open steppe, where a Soviet breakthrough could cut off entire armies. The supply lines were overstretched, already struggling to keep units fed and armed. And the Red Army, contrary to Hitler's delusions, contrary to the propaganda that portrayed Soviets as subhuman and incapable of learning, was learning, adapting, getting better. By autumn, by September and October, German forces were bogged down in street fighting in Stalingrad, a city that was supposed to fall in days, but instead became a meat grinder that consumed entire divisions. Reports from the front painted a desperate picture that contradicted official propaganda. Units were taking 50% casualties. Buildings were being fought over floor by floor, room by room, sometimes changing hands 5 or 6 times in a single day. The Soviets had no intention of yielding. When the encirclement came in November, when Soviet forces broke through the Romanian and Italian armies protecting the German flanks and linked up behind Stalingrad, trapping the entire Sixth Army in a pocket, it stunned Berlin, shocked Hitler, but it did not surprise the officers who had seen the warning signs, who had been warning for months that this could happen. For the first time, an entire German field army, not just a division or a corps, but an entire army of 300,000 men, was surrounded and doomed. Inside the frozen city, inside the pocket where men were dying of cold and hunger and typhus, General Friedrich Paulus maintained radio contact with Hitler, sending increasingly desperate messages, pleading for permission to attempt a breakout while it was still possible. None came. Hitler ordered Paulus to hold his position, promised that supplies would be flown in by the Luftwaffe, promised that a relief army would break through to rescue them. Both promises were lies, or at least proved to be impossible. The Luftwaffe couldn't fly in enough supplies. The relief army was stopped short. The Sixth Army perished where it stood, surrendering in February 1943. 90,000 survivors marching into Soviet captivity, where most of them would die. The psychological effect was devastating. more damaging than the military loss, though the military loss was catastrophic enough. Stalingrad shattered the myth of invincibility that had sustained the Wehrmacht since 1939. Officers who had once scoffed at the idea of defeat, who had dismissed concerns as pessimism or defeatism, now faced defeat in its purest form, total and absolute. The unspoken question spread like a contagion through the officer corps, whispered in private conversations, written in careful code in letters, discussed in euphemisms that everyone understood. If this could happen to the finest army Germany had ever fielded, if the Sixth Army could be destroyed, if Paulus could be forced to surrender, what hope remained? What chance did Germany have of winning this war? The spring of 1943 brought no real recovery, only the illusion of one, only temporary stabilization that masked fundamental weakness. The Wehrmacht prepared a massive counteroffensive at Kursk, in the salient that bulged into German lines, intended to restore the balance on the Eastern Front, to prove that Germany could still attack, could still win victories. Operation Citadel, it was called, and it would involve nearly 1 million German troops, thousands of tanks including the new Tigers and Panthers, the latest and most advanced armor Germany could produce. Many generals privately doubted the plan from the beginning. Intelligence reports, which were harder to ignore now, suggested the Soviets were heavily fortified in the Kursk salient, that they knew the attack was coming, that they'd been preparing defenses for months. The element of surprise, the key ingredient in blitzkrieg, was gone. The attack had been delayed repeatedly, giving the Soviets more time to prepare. Yet Hitler insisted on attacking anyway, convinced that German willpower and superior German weapons would prevail. Kursk was the last great German gamble of the war, the last time Germany would try to seize the initiative on the Eastern Front, and its failure sealed the strategic outcome. The offensive began on July 5, 1943. The Red Army's defenses held firm, deeper and more sophisticated than German commanders had expected. Lines of anti-tank ditches and minefields and interlocking fields of fire. German armor was decimated, hundreds of tanks destroyed or disabled, the new Panthers breaking down mechanically, the Tigers too slow and too few to make a difference. The Soviets counterattacked while the German offensive was still underway, demonstrating a level of operational sophistication that shocked German commanders. When the offensive collapsed after less than 2 weeks, when Hitler called it off because Allied forces had landed in Sicily and he needed to divert forces to Italy, there would be no more major German victories on the Eastern Front. The generals now fought a retreating war, a defensive war, trying to hold ground they knew they would eventually lose. They could inflict casualties. They could win tactical victories. They could delay the Soviet advance, but they could not win. Not anymore. After Kursk, even the most loyal officers, even men who believed in Hitler with religious fervor, began to sense the inevitable. Hitler still ranted about miracle weapons, about the V-2 rockets and jet aircraft that would turn the Pointfeu tide, about the indomitable will of the German soldier that would overcome material disadvantages. But the men who commanded those soldiers could read the maps. They could do the arithmetic. They saw the Red Army advancing inexorably westward, liberating Soviet territory, pushing toward Poland, toward the borders of Germany itself. And they knew the Allies would soon strike in the west, opening a second front that Germany simply didn't have the forces to contain. For the first time, many officers realized that the war would not end with victory or even with negotiation, with some kind of compromise peace. It would end with destruction, with complete and total defeat, with armies destroyed and cities occupied and Germany itself partitioned. By the end of 1943, the mood inside the officer corps had changed entirely, had transformed from confidence to something approaching despair. The arrogance of 1940, when officers joked about which Paris café they'd drink champagne in, had given way to quiet fatalism. German industry could no longer replace losses. Factories were being bombed day and night by British and American air forces. Skilled workers were being drafted into the army. Resources were running short. Allied bombers ruled the skies over Germany, striking with impunity, destroying refineries and factories and rail yards. The U-boat fleet was being annihilated in the Atlantic, submarine crews dying in steel coffins at the bottom of the ocean. Generals who had once preached blind loyalty to Hitler, who had dismissed concerns as cowardice, began to talk in cautious tones about saving what could be saved, about protecting Germany from complete destruction, about the need to end the war before there was nothing left to save. Some officers began to contemplate the unthinkable, something that violated every principle of military obedience they'd been taught: removing Hitler himself. The idea had surfaced before during moments of crisis, in 1938 before Munich, in 1939, before Poland, whispered conversations about staging a coup. But now it found adherents even among high-ranking staff officers, men with access to Hitler, men who could conceivably pull it off. Men like Klaus von Stauffenberg, a colonel who'd been severely wounded in North Africa, who'd lost an eye and a hand and several fingers, who'd seen enough of Hitler's incompetence to be convinced that the Führer was destroying Germany. Henning von Treschow, a general who'd tried to kill Hitler with a bomb disguised as brandy bottles on Hitler's plane. Ludwig Beck, former chief of the General Staff, who'd resigned in protest in 1938 and now coordinated resistance from the shadows. These men were not merely idealists disgusted by Nazi crimes, though they were disgusted. They were professional soldiers who had concluded, based on military analysis, that Hitler was leading Germany to annihilation. To kill him, they reasoned, was not treason. It was salvation. It was the only way to save Germany from total destruction, to negotiate surrender before Soviet armies reached Berlin, to preserve something of the German state. Yet such thoughts remained treacherous, dangerous to even think about, much less act upon. The Gestapo was everywhere, its informants infiltrating military units, listening to conversations, reading mail, looking for signs of defeatism or disloyalty. Dissent, even in private, even expressing doubt about ultimate victory, could mean death, could mean arrest and interrogation and execution. Officers who spoke too freely disappeared. For most generals, it was easier to remain silent, safer to tell themselves that perhaps the tide might yet turn, that perhaps something would change. Some placed hope in new weapons, in the V-2 rockets, and Me-262 jet fighters that Hitler promised would devastate Allied cities and sweep Allied aircraft from the skies. Others fantasized about a rift between the Western Allies and the Soviets, hoped that Americans and British would realize the Soviets were the real threat, would make common cause with Germany against Bolshevism. But beneath every rationalization, beneath every desperate hope, lay the same buried truth that no one wanted to acknowledge. The war was lost. Germany had lost. The only question was how much more it would suffer before the end came. In 1944, that truth became undeniable, impossible to ignore even with the most creative self-deception. On June 6th, Allied armies stormed the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in history, establishing a foothold in France that would prove impossible to dislodge. Within days, it was clear that the Western Front could not be held indefinitely, that Germany was now fighting a two-front war it couldn't win, that the nightmare scenario German military planners had dreaded since Bismarck's time had become reality. German forces were overstretched, trying to defend too much territory with too few troops, short of fuel that was becoming increasingly scarce as Allied bombers destroyed refineries and synthetic fuel plants, and hampered by Hitler's micromanagement, his insistence on controlling every detail of military operations from his bunker hundreds of kilometers away. The generals who had once prided themselves on maneuver warfare, on the flexibility and initiative that had made blitzkrieg possible, were now reduced to executing suicidal orders dictated from a map room by a man who hadn't visited the front in years. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B in France, the Desert Fox, who was probably Germany's most famous general, saw the situation clearly. Touring the front lines after the Normandy invasion, walking through positions that were being hammered by Allied naval gunfire and airstrikes, he confided to his staff that the war was hopeless, that continuing to fight was pointless. The enemy's material superiority is overwhelming, he said, in words that were recorded in diaries and letters. They have more tanks, more planes, more ammunition, more fuel, more everything. Every day we prolong this war is a crime. We're killing our own soldiers for nothing. Rommel quietly urged Hitler to negotiate a peace with the Western Allies, to surrender to the Americans and British before the Soviets reached Germany, to salvage something from the wreckage. But Hitler's response was fury, was accusations of defeatism and cowardice. When the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler failed, when Stauffenberg's bomb in Hitler's headquarters wounded but didn't kill the Führer, Rommel was implicated even though he probably wasn't directly involved in the plot. Faced with the choice between trial and death, between public humiliation and private suicide, he chose the latter, swallowing poison in his car while SS men waited outside. Other generals met similar fates in the purge that followed the failed assassination attempt. Gunther von Kluge, commanding in the West, also came under suspicion after the failed plot, suspected of having known about it or even supported it. Summoned to Berlin to answer questions, he swallowed poison en route, dying in his car rather than face interrogation and execution. Many others were executed outright, hanged from meat hooks with piano wire in films that Hitler watched repeatedly. Hundreds of officers and officials connected to the plot or suspected of disloyalty arrested and killed. The officer corps was decimated by its own despair, by men who could see the end coming and tried to save Germany and paid with their lives. The failure of the July plot had a chilling effect that silenced dissent completely. Whatever illusions of internal reform or military salvation remained were extinguished. The surviving generals understood that the regime would destroy itself and them with it, that Hitler would fight to the last German, would rather see Germany reduced to rubble than admit defeat. Still, they continued to fight, partly out of duty, out of the military tradition of obedience that had been drilled into them since cadet school, partly out of fear, knowing what would happen to them and their families if they refused, partly out of inertia, because what else could they do, and partly out of a desperate hope that somehow, impossibly, things might change. By early 1945, Germany was collapsing on all fronts, the map shrinking inward, the Thousand-Year Reich contracting toward Berlin. The Red Army was advancing through East Prussia and Silesia, driving German civilians before them in desperate refugee columns, taking revenge for German atrocities in Russia. The Western Allies were crossing the Rhine, driving into the industrial heartland of the Ruhr. The country lay in ruins, cities reduced to rubble by Allied bombing, industry shattered, transportation networks destroyed. And yet Hitler continued to issue impossible orders, orders that bore no relation to reality. Cities were to be held to the last man. Armies that no longer existed except on maps were to counterattack. Civilians were to be conscripted into a Volkssturm, a people's militia made up of old men and boys, given rifles and Panzerfausts, and told to stop Soviet tanks. Many generals no longer obeyed. Not really. They falsified reports, telling Berlin that orders had been carried out when they hadn't been. They ignored orders that would result in pointless massacres. They quietly surrendered their commands to approaching Allied forces, negotiating local ceasefires. Others clung to the fantasy that the Western Allies might turn against the Soviets, that Americans and British would realize the Bolshevik threat. would join Germany in a final anti-communist crusade. But such hopes were delusions born of desperation, fantasies that had no basis in reality. In April 1945, as the Soviets closed in on Berlin, fighting their way through the suburbs, shelling the city center, the last vestiges of discipline disintegrated completely. Hitler raged at his generals in his bunker, accusing them of betrayal and cowardice, screaming that the German people had proven themselves weak and deserved to be destroyed. Yet even he could no longer deny what they had known for years. On April 22nd, during a meeting in the Führerbunker, he broke down completely, admitting that the war was lost and that suicide was his only escape. For the generals listening, the moment carried no relief, no sense of vindication that they'd been right all along. They had lived through the disintegration of everything they once believed in. Honor and discipline, and the myth of German superiority all reduced to ashes. Some, like General Walter Wenck, tried to rescue civilians fleeing the Soviets, using his army to open corridors for refugees rather than fighting. Others simply waited for capture, burned their papers, changed into civilian clothes, tried to disappear. A few, like Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl, remained loyal to the end, signing the unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945, that marked the final humiliation of the regime they had served so faithfully. Looking back, one might wonder how men so intelligent, so seasoned, so professionally competent could have deluded themselves for so long. How could they not have seen from the beginning that Germany couldn't defeat the combined forces of Britain, America, and the Soviet Union? How could they have believed in victory when the mathematics so clearly pointed to defeat? The answer lies partly in ideology, partly in pride, and partly in fear. Many of Hitler's generals shared his contempt for democracy, his hatred of communism, his belief that Germany had been betrayed in 1918 and deserved another chance. They believed that whatever his flaws, whatever his excesses, Hitler had restored Germany's honor, had rebuilt the army, had made Germany powerful again. To admit defeat was to admit that everything they had fought for since 1933, and indeed since 1918, since the humiliation of Versailles, had been a lie. That was psychologically impossible for many of them. Others were trapped by circumstance, by the structure of military obedience. The Wehrmacht was not a monolith. It was a vast institution bound by loyalty, habit, and hierarchy that had developed over centuries. To rebel against Hitler was to betray not just a leader, but an entire system of obedience that defined a soldier's identity, that gave meaning to military service. When the first hints of defeat appeared in 1941 and 1942, most officers chose denial over defiance because acknowledging defeat meant acknowledging that their entire lives had been wasted. When defeat became certain in 1943 and 1944, they lacked the moral courage to act upon it, to stage a coup or refuse orders or simply stop fighting. Yet there were exceptions, and this is important to remember. Men like Stauffenberg and Beck and Treschow, who risked everything to end the madness, who tried to kill Hitler and failed, who were executed for their efforts. Their failure sealed Germany's fate. After July 1944, after the bomb plot failed and the conspirators were hunted down and killed, the war became an exercise. In futility, a slow-motion collapse carried forward by inertia and terror. Millions more would die in the last 10 months of the war. Soldiers and civilians, Germans and their enemies, all dying in a war that everyone knew was lost. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, when the last German units surrendered, when the flags came down and the armies dissolved, the reckoning began. In Allied interrogation rooms, in prisoner-of-war camps, in post-war memoirs that would be published years later, the generals spoke freely at last. They blamed Hitler, the SS, the Nazi Party, anyone but themselves. They claimed they had seen the disaster coming and tried to avert it, had argued against the Russian invasion, had warned about Stalingrad, had begged Hitler to negotiate peace. Some even portrayed themselves as victims of a mad dictator they could not control, as professionals corrupted by a politician, as patriots betrayed by a tyrant. There was truth in some of these claims. Hitler was a tyrant. He did make catastrophic decisions. He did ignore military advice. But there was also evasion, also self-justification, also the human need to believe that you weren't responsible for atrocity and defeat. Many of those who later insisted they knew the war was lost, who claimed in their memoirs that they had recognized defeat as early as 1941, had continued to obey orders that prolonged the slaughter. They had rationalized their complicity as duty, as honor, as following orders, as doing what soldiers do. They had watched Germany be destroyed and done nothing to stop it. The tragedy of Germany's generals was not merely that they recognized defeat too late, though that was tragic enough. It was that even when they did recognize it, even when they knew with certainty that the war was lost, they lacked the will to stop it. They kept fighting. They kept obeying. They kept sending men to die for a cause they knew was hopeless. From the frozen steppes of Russia, where men froze in their foxholes, to the rubble of Berlin, where Soviet soldiers raised their flag over the Reichstag, the evidence of failure was plain. By 1943, the war was strategically lost. Germany could not win. By 1944, it was militarily hopeless. Germany could not even force a stalemate. By 1945, it was morally bankrupt, fighting only to delay the inevitable. But long before the final capitulation, long before the signature on the surrender documents, in the quiet moments between battles, in the hours before dawn when officers sat alone with their maps and their thoughts, many of Hitler's generals had already surrendered in their hearts. They could see what he could not, or what he refused to see. That Germany's destiny was sealed not in the ruins of Berlin, not in the last desperate days, but in the arrogance of 1941, when they mistook lightning war for omnipotence, when they mistook conquest for invincibility, when they invaded the Soviet Union, believing they could win in weeks. The tragedy of the Wehrmacht was that it kept fighting long after it knew it was beaten. And in doing so, in continuing to fight for months and years after defeat became certain, it ensured that defeat would not only destroy Hitler and the Nazi regime, but the nation he had promised to make eternal. Millions died who didn't need to die. Cities were destroyed that didn't need to be destroyed. Germany was partitioned and occupied and divided because the generals kept fighting when they knew they should stop. That is how defeat truly unfolded in Nazi Germany. Not in a single climactic moment, not in one decisive battle, but as a creeping awareness that spread through the very men who had once believed they commanded destiny itself. When Hitler's generals realized they had lost, there was no announcement, no proclamation, no moment of public acknowledgement, only silence, only disbelief, only the slow, inevitable disintegration of faith. They had gambled everything on victory. When it failed them, when the dice came up snake eyes, there was nothing left to believe in, nothing left to fight for, nothing left but the terrible knowledge that they had destroyed their own country, and they had known it was happening, and they had done it anyway.